Good afternoon, and welcome to Ask the Doc. We've taken a few months of a hiatus, but we're back with a great summer lineup, and I'm excited to share some of our experts in Alzheimer's and dementia research. If you're new to the program, Ask the Doc is a monthly live program where we invite our audience to ask questions of our experts in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. My name is Dr. Megan Woodbracht. I'm the Associate Director of Education here at UCI Mind. And UCI Mind is one of about 35 federally designated Alzheimer's disease research centers that's funded by the National Institute on Aging, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. Today, I'm joined by a repeat guest, Dr. Elizabeth Head, who is a professor of pathology and the vice chair of research for that department. Dr. Head received her master's and PhD in neuroscience from the University of Toronto, and then came to UC Irvine to do a postdoc. She later took on a faculty position here at UC Irvine, and then went to the University of Kentucky, where she served as professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Nutritional Science. In 2019, she rejoined the faculty at UCI and UCI Mind, where again, she serves as professor here. She's also the leader of the research and education component for UCI Mind. And she studies Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. So welcome, Dr. Head.
Great, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Megan.
Thank you. And then to our viewers, thank you for joining us. If you have questions, you can add them to the comment box that's next to the video, and we'll get to them as we can. And just remember that anything that you post on the internet lives there forever, so be responsible. And with that, let's get started. Okay, great. Dr. Head, maybe we should start with the basics. What is Down syndrome, and how many people in the US are affected?
So Down syndrome is a genetic disorder that's driven by an extra copy of chromosome 21. And it's one of the few kind of chromosomal disorders that is survivable. So that's why we have over 400,000 people with Down syndrome living in the US alone. And that extra copy of chromosome 21 has a bunch of genes on it that leads to some of the concerns we have with people with Down syndrome, including intellectual disability, some of the shapes of the face, etc. So it's a genetic disorder driven by an extra copy of a chromosome.
Very good. And so there seems to be a link between Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. What is the likelihood that someone with Down syndrome will develop Alzheimer's disease later in life?
So that's the number that we're most concerned about. On average, over the age of 40, up to 90% of people with Down syndrome will develop signs of dementia. And just like in the general population, age is a big part of that equation, so that if a person is in their 50s, 30% of those folks might have dementia or develop dementia. And as they get older, that percentage increases to 50%, and across the lifespan, it's 90%. So that's a number that we are really trying hard to reduce.
And why is Alzheimer's disease so common in people with Down syndrome?
So chromosome 21 has 300 to 400 genes, depending on which literature you read. And there's a number of genes on that chromosome that are related to Alzheimer's disease. So the one that we focus on the most, or that we certainly know the most about, is the amyloid precursor protein gene, is on chromosome 21. And when you have too much of that gene, it's making too much of that protein, the amyloid precursor protein. And that protein is a very long protein that gets cut into a smaller piece called beta amyloid, which I'm sure many of the audience is very familiar with. And that beta amyloid protein forms plaques in the brain that are one of the key pieces in Alzheimer's disease. So what this means for people with Down syndrome is across their entire lifespan, they are making too much beta amyloid, even from birth and before birth. So what's really fascinating to think about, and this gives me hope for people with Down syndrome, is that even though they're making too much of this protein across the lifespan, it doesn't start to make plaques until they're in their 30s, give or take. So that means there's something good happening all the way along that helps them compensate or very rapidly turn that protein over so it doesn't stick around long enough to make a lot of plaques. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can figure out what some of that is, that could be a potential target for intervention for people with Down syndrome, mm-hmm. and then maybe by extension to everybody. So that's a key reason that we see Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome is because of that extra gene.
And are there any hints about what that protective factor might be or factors?
There could be a few hints. Chromosome 21, like I said, has a lot of genes. Thankfully, it's the smallest chromosome, so it's not like we're overwhelmed with trying to figure out how 10,000, 20,000 genes are part of this story. Mm-hmm. But there's at least one gene called the beta amyloid cleaving enzyme gene. A version of it is on chromosome 21. And the way that that protein operates is it helps turn over or degrade beta amyloid. Mm-hmm. Or sorry, I take it back. It cleaves the amyloid precursor protein in a way that prevents beta amyloid from being produced. Okay. So that could be, there could be a yin and yang going on with those two things. There's also lots of other genes on chromosome 21 that are good for your brain. So there's genes that help with synapses function, the connections between neurons in the brain. They're making too much of some of those proteins, and maybe those are protective in some way. But the bottom line is there's lots of things that we can look at and lots of targets, but not an overwhelming number. And so we'll see what the future holds with that.
Yeah, that's exciting. Okay, so you talked about kind of around age 30 is when you're starting to see plaques develop in people with Down syndrome. When are the clinical symptoms? When do you typically see clinical symptoms arise?
Right, so that's another kind of interesting part to the story. So we know that in people with Down syndrome, by the time they're 40, they will have enough plaques and the tangles that we see in Alzheimer's disease, enough of those present by age 40 that they would have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in their brains. Mm. But we don't typically see, or on average, we don't typically see changes in cognition signaling decline towards dementia until, on average, about 53 years of age. In fact, that number is strikingly similar across many studies around the world. Wow. So we won't see those clinical changes till almost a decade after they have all the brain pathology. So that gives us another opportunity, of course, for intervention and trying to understand how can the brain compensate for all that Alzheimer's disease pathology and not show a change in function for a long time. And then something happens and the system kind of fails, and then you see the signs of clinical decline. But there's actually a very large range of age of onset. So there are, very few number of people might show signs of dementia in their late 40s. 50s is kind of a prime time. Mm-hmm. But some people get out into their 60s without showing signs of decline. And now that people with Down syndrome are living longer and longer and have better quality of life, we're seeing people live into their 70s. And about 10 to 15% of people seem to escape showing any signs of dementia, which is remarkable given how much pathology is in the brain. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything unique about their genetic profile or their lifestyle or something?
Right, it could very well be lifestyle. In fact, it most likely is a combination of genetics and lifestyle, just like it is for everybody. So there could be genes that are protective, and lots of folks are working on what happens when you model that, say in mice, for example. Mm-hmm. But lifestyle factors, just like, with everybody, there's all kinds of lifestyle risk factors that can contribute to your age of onset or your risk of developing dementia. And so, for example, people with Down syndrome have a much higher frequency of sleep apnea. because of the structure of the neck and the tongue. And sleep apnea, we know, is a risk factor for dementia because your brain is losing oxygen at those times when you're not breathing well. And if we could control that, could that potentially be one reason why we're getting such variability in the age of onset? We also have, we don't have a lot of the same cardiac risk factors in people with Down syndrome, which is really great. That I think protects them because vascular risk factors, cardiac risk factors, high blood pressure, all those things enhance risk of dementia in the general population. But a lot of those risk factors are actually absent in people with Down syndrome, which is kind of cool. So we can figure that one out too. We could go back to people with Down syndrome and help them have a better quality of life, but then we can also maybe take that to everybody. So it's probably a mix of both. It's a mix of both.
Interesting. Now you mentioned 53. Can you elaborate on that age? Do people with Down syndrome develop clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in a tighter age range if they're going to develop it? Is that what you're suggesting or what the research has found?
Yeah, it's a really puzzling thing to me. I don't understand why that age seems to be such a consistent feature across, like I said, studies all around the world. From the United Kingdom, from Spain to the US, it's around that age. And so I don't know why that is. I do know that the age range of when a person might develop dementia, say between 40 and 60, 20 years, if you pick that up and put that up down on the general population, that's not far off. The big difference, of course, is everything is shifted earlier. So people with Down syndrome are showing signs of dementia in their 50s, whereas in the general population, the most common form obviously is over 65. But in the general population, you're looking at between 65 and over 100, where you might see signs of dementia. So yes, in some respects it's shifted younger, and maybe it's a little tighter. And also the rate of decline is faster in people with Down syndrome. So just everything is really crunched to a tighter timeline.
Good. So you had mentioned cardiovascular risk factors that aren't necessarily always present in people with Down syndrome. Are there other protective factors? So you'd mentioned cardiovascular, also sleep apnea. Anything else?
So I think the biggest set of protective risk factors, or risk factors they aren't as vulnerable to, is high blood pressure. That is not something people with Down syndrome typically develop. In fact, if anything, they have hypotension, so lower blood pressure. And they also don't typically develop atherosclerosis, which is a big driver of vascular problems in the brain. So those are really, really good things. But then again, some of the other risk factors like sleep apnea, other things include, which contribute to sleep apnea are obesity and being overweight. They also have a number of other co-occurring illnesses that we're still trying to understand how they contribute to onset of dementia or protection. For example, there's a high prevalence of hypothyroidism in people with Down syndrome. And, the lifestyles have gotten much, much better. The people who are older with Down syndrome now, who are, say, in their 60s, they didn't have access to the same kind of opportunities as younger people with Down syndrome are having now, which is pretty terrific. So there's probably other lifestyle factors that we haven't yet captured or looked at in detail. And we have a number of studies that are really dedicated to looking at that. Other kinds of things we could think about are the apolipoprotein E risk factor, which after age is the next biggest genetic driver of Alzheimer's disease. And it does appear that people with Down syndrome who carry that E4, which is the most high risk, also might show earlier age of onset of dementia. But we do have this big genetics background of which to kind of figure this all out. And another kind of fun thing that we're really looking at hard in the lab, I have a graduate student, Ellie Andrews, who's looking at this, is what effects do sex have on driving Alzheimer's disease? We know women tend to be more affected by Alzheimer's disease in the general population. Does something similar happen for women with Down syndrome? And I think that's a fascinating question because women with Down syndrome go through menopause 6 years younger
Mm.
than women in the general population. So there are many, many unanswered questions. And I think now there's so much data being generated by all these wonderful groups around the world who we all work together. And we're trying to figure out what are the drivers of earlier onset so we can try to manipulate those. But also, what are the drivers that let a person with Down syndrome go into their early 70s without decline?
Mm-hmm.
So two sides of the coin. And, I think there's really great opportunities here.
Absolutely. And you touched on some of what I'm going to ask you now, but I think it's important to really reiterate it. We know that, studying Alzheimer's disease in all populations is really important, but why in particular is studying Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome so important?
I kind of look at it in a couple of ways. The most important reason for me is for people with Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
This, to me, in my mind, is a very underserved group of people.
Mm-hmm.
They're very high risk. Your average family doctor doesn't quite know how to manage dementia in a person with Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. And although things thankfully are changing, for the most part, they've been excluded from clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And it's turning out that some of the medicines we use to manage Alzheimer's disease in the general population don't work great for people with Down syndrome, and some might even be associated with more adverse effects. Wow. So my personal take on this is we really need to figure out how to manage this disease in people with Down syndrome specifically. Mm-hmm. What does it tell us about everybody else who develops Alzheimer's disease, and what's the benefit? So one of the key things I think is helpful to think about is the age dependency of all the brain changes that we see in people with Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. So a person who is 35 with Down syndrome, I can say with some pretty good confidence, they're going to have plaques and tangles. Mm-hmm. I don't need to do a PET scan. I don't need to do a blood test, although we're doing those things, don't get me wrong. But I would feel pretty good about predicting that. If a person with Down syndrome was 45 or 50, I know for sure their brains are going to have enough pathology for Alzheimer's disease. We cannot do that in the general population, right? Mm-hmm. I could say a person who's 65, that's probably what's going on in their brain because the age of onset of Alzheimer's is so broad. So why is this a good thing? It's a good thing, I think, because if we really want to design prevention studies mm-hmm. to prevent Alzheimer's disease, which I think we all agree is important to focus on, we don't want to disregard people who have the disease. We need to make sure we continue to stay on top of developing interventions for them too. But for Down syndrome, maybe what we want to do is to prevent Alzheimer's disease is focus on people in their 20s. And we don't have to wait 60 years, 80 years to see if it worked. Mm-hmm. Or another way to think about it is depending on the age of that person, we may need to target different kinds of problems. So in their 30s, maybe we only need to worry about plaques. In their 40s, maybe we have to worry about plaques and tangles. But I think we have a much more precise way to potentially prevent or treat Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And then by extension, we can pick that up and try to apply it in people in the general population. Mm-hmm. I'm learning for them, but also from them.
That's important. Can you expand on that?
So I think one of the things that we're working on really hard, a lot of groups are working really hard on, is we're trying to figure out what is the same about aging and Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome and what is different, because that's going to help us in the long term, because some treatments or preventions we're going to use might only work for people with Down syndrome or work best for them. Mm-hmm. Others might not work for them, but work great for everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. So some things we could think about is, again, what is the impact of lifestyle modifications? This might be a really wonderful group of people who would benefit from those types of interventions mm-hmm. that we understand really do impact risk. So if we encourage people in their 30s and 40s to get exercise, to be socially engaged, to learn new skills, a lot of the same things we're already thinking about. Right. Or reduce risk factors of co-occurring illnesses that might affect brain aging. Mm-hmm. There might be a huge positive impact on brain aging in people with Down syndrome. And since, again, we don't have to wait so long, we might have a faster kind of insight into whether this might work in the general population. And studies like this are going on in familial Alzheimer's disease, people with presenilin mutations, for example, and they've done vaccine studies on those cohorts of people to see if they can prevent pathology. Same idea, but there are over 400,000 people with Down syndrome in the US, as I just mentioned. The number of people with these familial mutations is far, far smaller.
Mm.
So we have a potential to do some really powerful treatment studies or prevention studies that I think will really inform the general population.
Right, that's important. But we have a question actually from our audience, from Sherry. How does severity of disease in Down syndrome patients affect these results? Or maybe how does the severity relate to maybe Alzheimer's disease progression, if I can interpret that?
So how does the severity of the Alzheimer's disease in the brain maybe affect the clinical? I'm not sure.
Well, I think maybe, is there a correlation between severity of disease in Down syndrome with the age of onset or severity of Alzheimer's disease progression, maybe?
Yeah, I think the short answer is we don't know yet.
Okay.
Because really what that depends, well, we can do a lot of measures of Alzheimer's disease pathology when a person is still alive. We can do, PET imaging, we can see the plaques, we can do PET imaging for tangles, we can measure proteins in the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid. So I think as we start watching more and more people and following them over time, we'll have a better idea of when these changes happen and when do we see clinical changes, and does the rate of change in the brain predict rate of change in clinical outcomes. I think we're going to learn more and more in the coming years. In fact, I would say we're going to learn more and more just within the next 2 years, because there's so much data coming together now. But then the other part of the question is related to probably brain pathology, where we need to look at the brains of people who've made donations. And we do not have a lot of those. I think UCI Mind has probably the largest brain donation sample size. And those are the brains that we need to look at and kind of go back and think about what that person was like when they were alive, to answer a lot of these other questions. And also identify other changes in the brain that are going to be important to target as the treatment.
Okay, I have a follow-up question from Sherry. Is the number of Down syndrome patients expected to increase with the recent Supreme Court ruling? Wow.
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question.
You don't have to answer it. That might be a little too political, but
I'm not afraid to make a comment on it.
Okay.
So there is a good example of what happened in this case from Iceland.
Okay.
So in Iceland, every single woman is offered amniocentesis. And if there's a genetic abnormality or something that is not right with the baby, they are offered the opportunity to end that pregnancy. What happened in Iceland was the number of babies born with Down syndrome dropped to 1 in the entire country. And that raised alarm bells all around the world. So it's a really sensitive topic, and I think it needs to be talked about. But every person with Down syndrome has a life worth living. So I think that's what the consequences could be.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely an important message. And thank you, Sherry, for bringing that up. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, so I want to make sure we touch on some of the research that you're doing in your lab, because I've heard about it. I want to know more. Can you talk about your research?
I'd be happy, and of course I could talk forever, so you just have to stop me. So we have I would say two big projects ongoing. One relates to a longitudinal study of aging in people with Down syndrome that's in people who come to see us every 16 months, and we're able to assess their learning and memory ability. We do all the brain imaging. We get plasma samples, blood samples, so we can look at different proteins to see what might change to predict when that person may or may not convert. And for those who are willing, we also do cerebral spinal fluid samples as well. Those are a little trickier. And the plan is we're following these folks every 16 months. And we have across the country and in the United Kingdom multiple sites that are working together to get over 500 people in the study to follow them. And there's only a handful of other studies around the world that are essentially doing the same thing, which is why we all work together. Mm-hmm. So that part of my life is just a blast. It's so much fun. The families are amazing on how well they stayed committed to the study, and we need them desperately to stay involved. On the bench side of things, our lab is very much focused on looking at inflammation in the brain, because there's a lot of genes on chromosome 21 that drive brain inflammation. Oh, wow. Could that be a target for a treatment in the future? We may find that so. We're looking at a lot of vascular factors. There's a lot of changes in the blood vessels in the brain in people with Down syndrome. Part of that's because they make too much beta amyloid, and that beta amyloid doesn't only make plaques, it sticks to blood vessels too. And then those blood vessels can't constrict and dilate properly. And so the brain doesn't get enough oxygen. And we're trying to understand that in a lot of detail to see if that's another potential target for us to intervene. So even though they don't have the systemic vascular risk factors, there's something driving a lot of pathology in their blood vessels in the brain. So, from a 30,000 foot level, those are kinds of the big questions we're looking at, and trying to understand when in the lifespan does each thing happen, so we know when should we target that as a treatment. Mm-hmm.
Great. And if people want to learn more about the research going on in your lab, where should they go? What should they do?
I'd love for them to go to our website. Our lab has a website, and please go take a look and visit and see who's all in the lab. We have amazing people, amazing graduate students and postdocs and technicians. So check us out. There's some resources and links there to lots of other Down syndrome resources, including this NIH-funded project that we're working on. And always feel free. There's contact information for me too in there.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Head. As always, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for coming and talking to us about this really important subject.
It was my pleasure, Megan. I love doing this.
Thank you. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Head's research in a live format, she's actually going to be speaking at our conference in the fall on September 9th, 2022. She's one of the invited speakers. So please come or register, come have lunch with us, meet Dr. Head. It's going to be a really fun day. So with that, let's conclude. If you want to get more information about our Ask the Doc series, visit our Mindcast website. And that is mind.uci.edu/Mindcast. And you can get all of our Mindcast videos, which include Meet the Team. It includes Accelerating Discovery. It includes videos from our donors and from our research participants. It's just a really great resource. And finally, if you're interested in participating in research, join our UCI Consent to Contact. This is a great opportunity that allows people who are interested in research with getting matched with studies that are recruiting. So with that, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time on Ask the Doc. Take care.
Thank you.